Well, first of all, thank you so much for all of this, Sarah and Margaret. It's absolutely wonderful to be here and to hear so much about a subject that's very dear to my heart. 15 years ago, when I started researching soldiers' food in the British Army, I had to preface every piece I ever gave with an explanation and almost an apology, because people would sit there and say, food, really, Rachel? Is this what historians want to know about? But, well, this historian did, and clearly there's a room full of historians who concur. But I was thinking about how I came to the subject of food, so I can give you some background. I'm not a business historian, I'm not a military historian. I came to food because I'm a First World War historian who's interested in how men react to the trauma of warfare. So I'd read a lot. In Britain, you can't grow up without being very familiar with war literature. Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, Remarque, this is what school children learn in Britain. So I was familiar with all that. Now, certainly for Britain, that literary canon is produced by middle-class men and officers. There's very little, apart from Isaac Rosenberg, that comes from the working classes. So I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll go to the Imperial War Museum and the National Army Museum, and I'll look through their records and I'll find accounts of what working class soldiers said about the emotional effects of war. So I didn't expect them to be as reflexive or as skilled in literary ways as the canon, but I thought I'd find a bit more than I did, because they don't write about emotion, but what they do write about endlessly is food. And officers do it too. It's not peculiar to the rank and file soldier. But I kind of started off, I suppose, with an idea that food was a metaphor for an emotional reaction to the trauma of war, and all those kinds of bonds, the kind of rituals that we've heard about from Jenny's paper, from Chantal's paper, practically from everybody's paper, about the function of food as not being calories and physiological, alone. It's about social bonds, it's about psychology, it's about connections with home. And of course, those things become very important when people are under pressure, as soldiers in the front line are. So those kinds of issues about connections between home and battlefront are very important to soldiers and their families, and food is a medium. These love packages, which is a great word, we call them food parcels, which is not quite as emotive, is it? Now, food is a hugely emotive subject. What do I point this at? Yes, there we go. So this is a diary from a British soldier, and he's talking about the rape of Belgium, which exercised a lot of British soldiers early on in the war, or certainly the first part of it. But he's saying that the lack of a second vegetable in his meal is on a par with the kind of German war atrocities that he has been reading about. Now, Aetius is not being ironic. He's not an ironic man. I have read the whole diary, and there's a lot of it. But food for the soldiers was very important, because they had given their lives, potentially, for their nation, and at the very least, they expected to be fed. And when they weren't, it signified a lot more than just ordinary hunger. It signified a complete lack of care and a disregard for their lives. So, this is a subject on which British soldiers could get very exercised. Not as exercised as the French, who obviously had riots, bread riots later on in the war, but there are, the British, the revolt, it's not really a revolution, a revolt at Etaples in 1917, a military camp in behind the Western Front. A lot of that was to do with very poor food. And in fact, the Shell Shock Commission that reports back in 1922 in Britain points to poor food as being very important in destroying morale. Now, I'm going to put up a hugely racist nationalistic slide, but bear with me, because the point of it is to show you, or to think about the identity and what food means to us. This idea of, I quite like a bit of social anthropology, and the ingestion of something into our bodies has to be something we feel happy about, because otherwise, why would we take that food in? It has to be something we recognise and that we're comfortable with. Now, British people were not comfortable. The British working class has a hugely rigid, narrow diet. And I think Voltaire, it's my kind of favourite quote really, said, the British, they have 42 religions and 2 sauces. What kind of people are they? But British food was bread, potatoes, working class diet, mainly bread, a bit of fat, a lot of jam, and meat very rarely. And the meat that was consumed was usually bacon, because it cooked quickly, it was quite strong and flavourful, so a little went a long way. So when they kind of thought, when they overran German trenches sometimes, they were appalled by the products that they found within it, blood, sausage. This is the kind of nation we're dealing with, that eat blood. He's obviously, Donald McGill does seaside postcards mainly, but he'd obviously never seen sauerkraut, which is not green, is it? But, he was kind of, this was the sort of attitude, this was the concern that the British Army had to deal with. You've got to feed, you're taking them somewhere strange, so they feel alienated from their surroundings. The food needs to try and recenter them, and make them feel unthreatened. So the British Army, very high calorie content. This is pretty much what the British Army gets nowadays, 4,200 calories, so on active service, but a much higher protein content. People didn't really understand nutritional sciences in its early days. Calorific value had only been discovered at the end of the 19th century. So there's still kind of, calories are good, and we don't care what form they come in. So, protein, fatty meat, there's a lot of protein in it, a lot of calories, that's good. But of course, for digestive purposes and energy purposes, complex, carbohydrates are probably better, which is the way the British Army has obviously gone. A lot of meat, often not fresh nor frozen, but tinned. And I don't know if you have the equivalent in Germany. It's called bully beef. It's a tinned beef. It's called, in England, it's called corned beef. It's normally imported from South America, and it's beef that's compressed and salted. It's quite a good source of protein, quite fatty, very salty. Not so great on a day like this when it liquefies in the tins. So people, anyway, gives you a sense of the kind of struggles the soldiers had. A lot of sugar too. 3 ounces of sugar a day. This is a daily ration. The British nation had a very sweet tooth. And one of the ways that the working classes had survived, as I was saying to Chantal, is tea with sugar, because it's a meal in itself, a hot meal, when other food wasn't available. Sugary tea. And in fact, sugar was often distributed with tea. So they mixed it all up together and gave you a bag of tea and sugar. And there are stories of officers, because they had more time on their hands, with feathers, separating the tea from the sugar because they didn't take sugar in their tea. But working class men would be more than happy to have that quantity of sugar. Fresh vegetables. Yeah, well, that's kind of a moot point, as we remember from Each's quotation, that fresh vegetables were quite hard to find. And again, they were regarded as kind of watery, weird, non-calorific things. What was the value? Potatoes were good, but everything else was a little bit suspect. Looking at the comparative figures, the German army ration is not dissimilar to this. Certainly frontline soldiers got more than those in the camps in Germany, as they did in Britain. But at this time, it was just over 4,000 calories, so very little difference in the calorific value. But the way in which it was made up is hugely different. There's a lot more emphasis on things like pulses, lentils, beans. British working classes at this period would have, it was potato, bread or nothing really, and meat. And also the other thing that intrigued me looking at the German ration was there were things like herbs and spices, marjoram, cloves, caraway. Again, not something the British soldier would have had much truck with. Salt and pepper and a bit of mustard, but nothing too fancy. So kind of, similar, they're not wholly dissimilar, the ration scales for all the Allied armies. The French got a bit more, 4,500 calories a day, but they were also entitled to a quantity of red wine, which kind of made that up, which subject of great, jealousy from the poor British soldiers. And of course, again, national stereotype day for me, but the Americans got the most, 4,700 calories a day. So a lot more potatoes, not that much more meat, really. Okay, so these are what the British Army said that they would give their soldiers. Now, of course, there are lots of issues in sitting in Whitehall, government, listing the rations and what some poor soul out, in the Ypres salient actually receives. Getting the supplies out there was a long and complicated story. Now, this is from a little book. It's called Diary of a Supply Officer, and he was so inflamed by his success in getting the food out to the troops that he wrote a little book about it in 1917, and it's in the Imperial War Museum, describing his daily routine and showing a map. There were huge base supply depots up on the French coast. And then each day, a train for a division, which is several thousand men, was set up from each of the supply depots. But some supply depots only had, say, potatoes and didn't have any meat, and vice versa. So they had to have what they call a regulating station on the left there, where the trains all came in together, or one after the other, and they swapped things around so they could even it out for each division. They then went to the railhead, near the front line for that particular group of troops, and then they went into the motor transport, which is all quite exciting. It's the first sort of motorised war for Britain, so they've got lots of trucks, but not that many trucks, because the trucks only go so far, and after that it's horses. And they call it the divisional train, which I found hugely confusing when I first started researching it, but the divisional train is actually a lot of horses and limbers pulling it up to near the front line, where again it's then put into sacks quite often and carried up to the front by men from the back. So a hugely complex process, mainly helped by it being a static war. So, this worked for a lot of the war. It was only, say, in 1918, the spring offensives, that these supply chains broke down. They also bought a lot of food locally from French farmers, or commandeered it. There was a lot of contest, over local food supplies. The British Army had gardens, set up gardens in northern France to grow its own vegetables, mainly potatoes, because of shortages and difficulties of shipping it in. So there were all sorts of different ways of making sure that food was available. Now, those supply depots are absolutely huge, half a mile long, the one at Le Havre, and they carried 80,000 tonnes worth of supplies. So these are men here shoveling, they had some potatoes as well as onions as well as their potatoes. So, those kinds of vegetables could be stored for quite a long while, worked quite well logistically. The Army Service Corps there, shifting it onto the trains that then bound up to the front. A lot of soldiers were very jealous of the Army Service Corps because they, had a relatively safe-ish existence, and they also very close to food, which again, they never went hungry, it was thought. They had plenty of access to the good things in life. Now, one of the best things in life for British working classes is bread. And what they issued instead of bread was hardtack biscuit. Is it Zwieback? Double-baked, like a very, the Navy had it originally. And British soldiers did not compare to a loaf of fresh bread. And again, another kind of issue for them, of course, is health. British working classes, dentistry was not part of their life. So teeth are appalling in the British Army. Peter Jackson, Hobbit fame and Lord of the Rings, did a wonderful, I don't know if you've seen it, he took British war films from the period and put them into, what's it, They Shall Not Grow Old, a wonderful feature-length film of First World War. And I don't know, those of you who've seen it, I mean, the teeth of those men, you kind of look at it and think, that must have hurt. These are gaping mouths, and so hardtack biscuit was absolutely unacceptable to the soldiers. A, because it wasn't familiar, and B, they couldn't eat it. It was all right if you ground it up and boiled it with some jam and condensed milk, but again, the possibility of doing that in the front line was relatively restricted. So the army sets up its own bakeries, mobile bakeries, which travelled around baking bread for the troops, which of course was popular because food and morale, and military performance are all inextricably linked. And getting the food to the front line hot, hot stew to frontline troops in cold weather is absolutely key. And when the army had started, they had made men run forward with Dixie cans, big cauldrons, which of course going through these narrow trenches was very dangerous, and they lost they lost more food, but they also lost a few soldiers, who didn't have their hands to steady them and fell into the mud and drowned. So pan packs, the guy in the front there, or You can see it more clearly. He's got a pan that's packed with straw to keep the food hot, and it also kept his hands free. And this was regarded by the British in 1916 as a hugely innovative, which might give you some idea of the technology, of the limited technology in the British Army, but this was a way, again, of solving the problem of getting food, hot food, to the soldiers at the front. British soldiers had iron rations, which included a small amount of meat and a few of these biscuits. And they weren't supposed to eat them until they were given permission by their officer, because they were supposed to be kept for emergencies. But as you can see from this sort of cartoon, this is a kind of joke of British soldiers desperate to get rid of these iron rations because they didn't like the hardtack biscuits they're holding out there, nor indeed the bouli beef. This is the kind of French children begging for food. There's a lot of stories at the beginning of the, Margaret mentioned that, about not getting as many gifts from the local population. There was a lot of food exchange at the beginning of the war, certainly, before the local supplies became more exhausted. But certainly giving food to children was regarded, something soldiers write a lot about in their letters, diaries and memoirs. Whether or not the children were suitably grateful, I wouldn't like to suppose, but say hardtack biscuit, really an unattractive and pretty much inedible piece of food. And soldiers were very imaginative in what they would do with it. Sergeant Herring, who had twins actually, I wonder why they're both the same age, it seemed a bit bizarre, but this is his wife and him and his twins, and he made a little picture frame from the hardtack biscuit. Soldiers painted on it. In the Imperial War Museum, they have one that was sent home as a postcard. I don't know if it did actually go through the post. Theresa Mergis has looked at the Huntley and Palmer, big biscuit maker, their archive, and they've got all sorts, Lord Kitchener on the front of it, regimental badges. There are jokes in cartoons of the period of, lighting fires with them. Robert Graves makes a lot of that in Goodbye to All That. But, not a great product for a hungry man. So the army has to kind of try and think on its feet. It never had to deal with supplying, 1.8 million men on the Western Front in March 1918. That's a lot of people to supply food to, and it hadn't really had to think about that before. So it does things like develop temporary kitchens, design ovens, teach its cooks how to build ovens. It also tried to teach its cooks how to butcher animals. I don't know, I've never read an account of them actually attacking, well, they stole chickens, lots and lots, but whether they went for anything bigger or bought anything bigger, a pig or a cow, I don't know. But certainly the army manuals have descriptions of how to deal with that. Although if you're a soldier, of course, you never had to learn how to pluck a chicken, because that left too much evidence. So you always skin chickens, turn it inside out, and you bury the evidence. If you start plucking it, there's going to be feathers, and the farmers are going to notice, and your officer might take some, task with you. Also, field kitchens movable, being able to put stew in vats, in wagons, and pull it along. A lot of the time on the Western Front for British Army is spent marching between reserve, front, back, they'd spend a lot of time walking. So these field kitchens were very useful in that they could give men hot food while they were walking. As you see, lots of recipes, but bully beef was a very significant part of almost all of them. So even something like fish paste has a higher quantity of beef in it than it does fish. So, British Army the British soldiers became very tired with this kind of monotonous diet of bully beef and the hardtack biscuit. I should say, I don't know about the German army, but in Britain, officers ate different. They paid money into a mess, and they had their own cook, and they did not rely on army rations in the same way that the rank and file did. So we're talking about rank and file soldiers here. Fish was not very popular. British people, thought fish was, unless it was fried with chips, it was a kind of bit of an alien product. But they had an issue, I think, who was it mentioned? The herring. That the British Army or the British government had bought up the whole of Norway's herring export to stop Germany buying it before it was prohibited. And so that meant British soldiers were getting herring for breakfast, in the training camps and things, which they took very ill. It was not a suitable breakfast product. So the British Army does its best, but mainly soldiers spend a lot of time looking for alternatives. What else can we find? What else can we eat? Now, there's a kind of famous pastel from John Singer Sargent of people scrumping, soldiers scrumping in an orchard. One of them looks slightly shifty, but this is kind of common practice. In the war, the infantry knew, a very good biography by Captain J.C. Dunn, who's a medical officer with a unit, and he said that the French farmers are always complaining about soldiers stealing, but we just say to them, we listen to the farmers and say yes, 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 and then we just say to the men, can you not wait till dark? Which was a kind of, the British Army was quite pragmatic, which probably didn't serve the farmers very well, but what did serve the farming communities or rural communities quite well are the estaminets, that lots of people took it into their own heads, to set up little cafes and serve mainly egg and chips, which was the great treat for the British soldier, maybe a bit of Vin Rouge, which they were very excited by, because that, again, weak beer would be a British drink. And also, I wonder, see the woman serving it on the right. A kind of, it's a family, it's a recreation of the kind of family, isn't it? That, Jenny was talking about the importance and significance of having a family unit and a family meal. And, soldiers do write a lot about being served food by women, and it reminds them of their mums, and they're quite, that has a value to it as well. They also help the French in the fields and could get more food that way. That was the kind of also, soldiers weren't very keen on doing that because they were there to fight, and didn't really want to fight, but they certainly didn't want to spend the time weeding and hoeing, that was really beneath them. But there was a kind of opportunity perhaps for romance, which was a way of seducing them into doing it, getting to know the French locals. And finally, there were canteens where you could buy extra sweets, chocolate, very important. This is a staged photograph with lots of lovely stuff in the canteen. When you read soldiers' accounts, they say, I queued for 2 hours and it's a box of matches and a boot polish tin when I get there, there's no food left. So they weren't necessarily as well stocked as this one suggests. But the other great alternative is these love gifts from home, is these kind of the love packages, the comforters to the soul. I like that phrase, and I think, that's absolutely key. In Christmas 1916, over 4.5 million parcels were shipped to the British Expeditionary Force from Britain. So it's a huge amount of, and not just food, but a lot of it was food. Soldiers often want homemade food because it reminds them of home. Well, obviously, but there's something about food made often by mothers because of the demographic of the British Army, which was young, also by wives, but it's a kind of special way of remembering family. So these parcels were hugely significant and a great burden on the economy, especially when food gets short later in the war, but also on impoverished working class families, especially if they've got more than one man serving abroad. Trying to find the funds to create these food packages was not easy. Soldiers were quite imaginative. You talk about the chocolate soldier. Well, George Hewins, who was a bit of a scoundrel, who was in the British Army, he was married with several children, but at his training camp, he embraced a new young friend who he came to call his chocolate girl, because the deal was she sent him lots of chocolate when he was abroad. And, even though he was married and a father, he wasn't ashamed to develop relationships in order to supply him with the kind of foodstuffs that he needed. So just to finish up, really, thinking about these relationships between the front and home. This is from the War Illustrated, very popular magazine. This is a British Christmas pudding. In the middle there, the great round, very odd, dark fruit kind of thing. But the caption at the top says it all, that it was made at home and it stirred thoughts of home for those men unpacking it in the trenches. And the kind of, the soldiers in another postcard there about the pleasure we take in tasting all the good things that you send us. So, they got sent socks and writing paper and things like that, but it was the food, that really mattered to them. And the kind of, those connections with home that even the First World War couldn't sever completely. And food was a way of maintaining those kind of loving relationships in a very material and useful fashion, but also a highly emotional fashion throughout the First World War. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
So the question I wanted to ask you is, do food packages come from the Caribbean or somewhere like that? What happens to the colonial soldiers? Do they get food packages? Does the postal service include them for receiving these parcels?
That's a very interesting point, and I've never looked at it. I mean, to be honest, there are very few number, apart from the Indian Army, which comes to the Western Front in quite large numbers early on in the war, but is then pushed out to Mesopotamia and the Middle East. The actual Caribbean regiments are very small in number. I would say as well, little I know about the Indian Army is they recruit from the poorest of the poor. So the notion that there would be lots of money at home to provide parcels, I think, I don't know the exact answer, but I would have thought it unlikely. Also, I mean, for the Australian troops, for example, the Anzacs, they don't get food parcels because even if their families probably could afford to send them, the amount of time it would take to get there. I mean, in Britain, the post was so good, you could post something in London and it would be in the trenches, sometimes the next day, maybe 48 hours. People sent over brawn, which is some disgusting meat jelly thing. And mostly it didn't go off. Sometimes it did, but mostly, people sent quite fresh items. But you can't do that at a distance. And a lot of the, non-white troops who serve on the Western Front are Labour Corps. Yeah, and again, yeah. Well, yes, there are. Yes, I'm thinking more about. I was thinking as well about religious dietaries. You couldn't keep kosher in the British Army, but you could. I mean, the Indian Army, for example, a lot of vegetarians, so they substituted ghee for the meat ration for the Indian Army. So yes, there are, a meal, sort of grain for corn, maize for the African Labour Corps on the Western Front. So there are adjustments for origin of troops, but there isn't any adjustment for religious, apart from 2 brigades who were recruited in Palestine to serve in the British Army. And part of the promise was that if they came to serve on the Western Front, they would get kosher food. But for all the other Jewish soldiers, they got dispensation from their rabbi, so they were allowed not to keep it. But
it's really interesting that.
Okay.
And
Sorry.
No.
I know Jane has a question.
Thank you very much for the fantastic talk. I'm interested in the mobile field kitchens. We have it too in the German army, and I was also thinking about the issue of identity again. Something you told us that the officers have different cooks for themselves, and something which was really new to the German army was a large part of the working class together with the middle class in the army, and it was totally new to them to eat with each other.
wow.
And I think it was an important issue for them, and I was wondering, was it an issue for the British army too? Was it something new to them to eat next working middle class men sitting next to a working class man eating together? Because you told us that they were together and
No, it's
have this sense of normality together eating and
well. They're together in the British Army. Together means we are one army. We're all serving, to defeat the same enemy. But the officers will eat over here, and the rank and file soldiers will eat over here. And in the British Army at this time, officer and rank and file meant not middle class, but upper middle class and working class. So the divisions within the British Army, whatever some military historians like Gary Sheffield might say, I think are retained pretty much throughout the war. When most of the officer, or a lot of the young officer corps is killed off in 1914, they have to promote people who aren't gentlemen, because officer and gentleman were synonymous up till then in the British Army. So they have to promote people who aren't gentlemen, because they didn't go to not just going to public school or private education, it was which school you went to. So if you went to Eton or Harrow, definitely an officer. If you went to some lower grade, Radley, maybe, So there were a whole list of schools. R.C. Sheriff, who wrote Journey's End, was initially excluded from the officer corps because he didn't go to the right public school. So they have to promote people who aren't part of that part of society. But they called them, or the ethos was that they were temporary gentlemen. So for the war, we have to... the army didn't say it like that, but that's how it was. And at the other end of the scale, you did get some men who were upper class and who didn't want to wait for the commission to come in. and they joined and became what were known as gentlemen rankers. So they were gentlemen. Was it one of them writes and says, oh, my officer, he's just driving about the war. He was quite an effete character. He said, I produced my checkbook, and he almost fainted that a rank and file soldier should have a checkbook. So there's very sort of strict class divisions in the British Army. And I think it's a really interesting question about what the army does to restructure the British class system. But that's still out for debate at the moment. Some people see it as a great opener of doors and merging of social classes, but I'm not so wholly convinced.